Welcome. I'm Robin. I'm a certified financial planner, certified private wealth advisor, wealth manager by profession, and your rich auntie. Today, I wanted to talk about inheritances. It's a very interesting topic, and it's something that I encounter regularly with clients. Someone dies unexpectedly, and they receive an inheritance. People talk a lot about generational wealth, but they often don't understand too much inheritances and how that mechanism of wealth transfer really works in American society. So I wanted to take some time today to break it all down and talk about wealth and the role that inheritance plays in passing on generational wealth. So, first things first, just some facts about inheritance that most people don't know is that the average inheritance in America is $58,000. Okay. The average American will not receive an inheritance. Most Americans do not receive an inheritance. And when Americans do receive an inheritance, they receive on average $266,000. So why is there such a big discrepancy between 58,000 and 266,000? Well, if you divide inheritances among the 330 million Americans, you get to 58,000. But once you take out the people who receive zero, the number goes up to 266,000. So if you receive an inheritance, the average inheritance amount is going to be 266,000. The average person receives an inheritance in their late 50s. Now, this is a result of people living longer. You have to think about it. 1 or 2 generations ago, people did not live on the regular until their late 80s or 90s. It just didn't happen. The medical technology was not good enough. Life expectancy, longevity just wasn't there. Most people were lucky to make it into their 60s or 70s, but that's about it. Now, in certain parts of the country, people regularly live until their 80s and 90s and even beyond. Well, that has a very positive impact on longevity of the person's life, but it does have an impact on the economy in terms of inheritances. Instead of receiving inheritances in 20s or 30s, and oftentimes that's when people need it the most, because that's when people are in their lowest income earning years, or starting out building their families, or buying their first home. They can really use that inheritance money. But the vast majority of people do not receive that inheritance money in their 20s or 30s. They receive it in their 50s, late 50s to be exact, when they're nearing retirement. That has a huge knock-on effect in the U.S. economy, and that money isn't getting a chance to circulate in the U.S. economy. A person who receives an inheritance at 25 is going to spend it a lot differently than a person who receives it at 55. So, there are fewer homes bought. There's less money spent on kids' education. There's less money that is spent on, upgrading homes, cars, vacations, whatever people tend to spend their inheritance dollars on. That's just not happening. And I, as a wealth manager, see it all the time. So typically what happens when someone receives an inheritance, typically they're quite mature in age. They're in their late 50s, 60s, or even 70s. And a parent or a close relative has passed on. Usually that parent or close relative was in their 90s. And suddenly this person in their late 50s or beyond receives a mid 6-figure or 7-figure amount of money. And, you think people would be ecstatic and receiving an inheritance, but to be perfectly honest, most people are rather blasé about it. Well, why is that? You have to think about it. If you are leaving or receiving an inheritance, you're probably in a good financial position already. You probably came from a family that's in a good financial position that set you up for a life to be in a good financial position. And by the time you're in your late 50s, you're winding up your career, you're in a high earning career, and you're receiving a sudden influx of money. People are not necessarily over the moon about it. They're kind of like, yeah, okay, yeah, I got this money. What should I do with it? It's the trippiest thing to see people in this state, but it's very much so true. And sometimes I speak to the beneficiary, and it's like the beneficiary doesn't even want the money. They're like, I really want this money to go to my kids or my grandkids. How can we make that happen? And the IRS, for various reasons, doesn't like skipping generations, so it's not as easy as moving it from one generation to another. But this concept that people are over the moon when they receive an inheritance, typically it's just kind of like, what, I kind of needed the money 20 years ago. I really don't need it now. What should I do with this money? And it's a really unusual thing to experience as a wealth manager. But when you look underneath the hood, you understand it. If you're already earning a good mid six-figure salary and you're a multimillionaire yourself, would you care about an extra million? So let's talk a little bit more about generational wealth. Typically, I don't use generational wealth or potential inheritances in any sort of financial planning. Like if I were to meet with you and plan out your retirement, we would pretend that inheritance doesn't exist. Why do I do that? Well, because we don't know if it will exist. Sometimes people have thought that they were going to receive inheritances, and the benefactor went into a long-term care event, and all the money went to their long-term care, and that was that. Sometimes there was a family issue and they thought they were receiving an inheritance and they didn't, or they received some amount that was different than their expectations. Or, they don't know at what age they're going to receive an inheritance. Okay, yes, they have a great aunt who's 90. Statistically, odds are the great aunt will pass sometimes in the next decade, but we really don't know if that's going to happen, when that's going to happen, or how it's going to happen. You can't really use that as a concrete factor in another individual's financial planning. So what do I say to people who want to create generational wealth for their kids or their grandkids? Essentially, it's becoming more challenging because lifespans are expanding, right? Like I said, your kid could really use that money in their 20s or 30s, but odds are they're going to inherit it in their late 50s, 60s, or beyond. What I do encourage people who want to help the current generation to consider doing is considering using the IRS gift exclusion, which this year I believe is at $17,000, to give money to the next generation when and while they need it. Meaning for people who are in their 20s and 30s who are doing well, but who need that extra boost. And the benefactor knows that they have these resources. They're not going to use these resources in their lifetime. Why wait until you're 95 and dead and your kid is in their 60s to help them out? Why not help them in their 20s, 30s when they really need it, if they're doing the right thing and if they're on the right path? So I have helped some wealthy families set up annual gifts to the next generation of $17,000, and that's $17,000 per person. So if you're a married couple, you can give $17,000 and your spouse can give $17,000. So up to $34,000, and it changes and increases every single year. But while the person is young and needs that money, and you are certain you are not going to use this money in your lifetime, why not make that transfer happen? So that is one way to address the issue of inheritances and people receiving inheritances later in life. Sometimes that transfer happens with cash. Sometimes it happens with highly appreciated stock. There's a lot of ways that you can do this to start transitioning money to the next generation so that they can actually see effect and they can actually see benefit. So I have a lot of thoughts about inheritances. It's a very interesting topic, and it plays a huge part in generational wealth. It also plays a huge part in generational disparities between certain groups. There are some changes that will likely happen to inheritance laws over the next decade. It's a very interesting topic. So if you found this information useful, please like, please share, and please subscribe.